Atou, haki hoi se la simomo, ne hoi se la simomo. Ne la samomo yelo o koe ki a paik simon ki te kotha ki o mala mai ama Oklahoma, tina Wyandotte, Oklahoma. E ka ki lai noms o holi wanaka ni tā sito, ni ki a Kerry Silverhorn, tina no thought Clint Silverhorn, tina Kokuchi, Teresa Peacock, tina Soma Lance Silverhorn. Atou, hello, how are you all doing today? Well, this right here, thank you for joining us for another CW Facebook live feed. And this will be my second live feed to do for y'all. The other one, if you haven't seen it, or any of the other American Indian live feeds, I would encourage you to go and check those out too. But this right here, we are going to talk a little bit about native systems of government, particularly in the northeastern woodlands in the 18th century, and the foundation of the United States as a constitutional republic, and looking at kind of the cultural role of government. So how did our democratic republic came to be, right? So particularly tribes like the Six Nations, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and later the Tuscarora, the Haudenosaunee tribes, right? The people of the Longhouse. The Guyana-Oshagoa, the Great Law of Peace, is their constitution, and it is estimated to have been created anywhere between 500 AD and 1100 BC. It is the oldest continuously functioning democratic system of government on the planet, and throughout its history, up until the 18th century at the formation of the American Republic, up until today, it still functions, and the Shawnee, Wyandot, and other tribes as well are also forms of republics in the modern day too. And so we're going to have some time right quick to talk about that system of government, the democratic republics of the Eastern Woodlands, and what the Founding Fathers are saying about Native people and their government and systems, their manners and customs, and also to some advice that Native people are giving sort of at the birth of the American nation. And then we'll get into a couple of modern sources from a little bit more recently in 1988 and 2006. And then we'll have a little bit of time for some question and answers after that. So feel free to ask questions about government, about general culture. You can also ask about things that I'm wearing. These are tools that we use to also get into cultural discussions as well. Ask about wampum and what that means and how it's used. How are treaties ratified? You can ask about any number of things. But the cultural perspective on government and the formation of a democracy is really what we're going to be taking a look at today. So I would start by kind of explaining what these systems of government are. Right? So in the Eastern Woodlands, you have tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Yuchi, the Creeks, Catawbas, Shawnees, Wyandots, Anishinaabeks, Miamis, Ottawas, hundreds of tribes here that all have various different systems of family and society, religion, and government. But what we kind of consider to be the big three characteristics are agricultural, democratic, and matrilineal. Those are kind of the majority characteristics of a lot of tribes in the Eastern Woodlands. And nowhere is that truer than tribes like the Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Delaware, who were heavily interacting with the English, who later became the Americans, all throughout the 17th and 18th century. And as well as nations like the French and the Dutch. So we see examples of mutual cultural exchange going back and forth all throughout this time, right? Whether they be material culture. Take a look at all the things that I'm here wearing, right? Silk ribbon, wool cloth, glass beads, metal cones, silver jewelry, linen shirts, etc. And going back to England, beaver furs and deer skins and etc., right? So we see this example of cultural exchange not only materially but socially in almost every aspect of life in the 18th century. Marriages are common between our communities, and so it's only natural that ideas are coming along with these people as well. So, if we think about the Great Law of Peace as a government, it was also a republic born out of conflict, right? A period of time before this was established, what's known as the Dark Times to many people, and for very good reason. If you've ever heard the concept or the argument that Native Americans, were not peaceful. They were killing one another and enslaving one another and going to war. At that point in our history, that was very much the truth. And so you look at that concept, that brother against brother, warring with one another and with other nations. The predominant concern of a lot of these nations at that time was power and military affairs, right? But some events took place where individuals started to have change of hearts. You think about Ionwatha, right? And then Jigonsase, a Seneca woman. And then with the help of the peacemaker, these three really kind of brought together the five nations and in what was to be kind of the first display of disarmament for the world, they uprooted a white pine tree and threw all of their weapons of war, their hatchets and the clubs and spears and bows and things like that, into that pit and buried them. That's where we get the phrase burying the hatchet, right? But with some of those arrows, the Hiawatha made a speech, the peacemaker made a speech to say that one arrow is easily broken, but many bound together are strong. And he proposed the concept of a unified nation, that all of these nations would remain independent and separate from one another, but would have this binding agreement that they would no longer go to war with one another, and that they would work for the good of all people, right? And they would urge others to accept this system as well. And so the Gaian Ashigwa, the Great Law of Peace, is 117 articles long, and like I said, it functioned from the time that it was created and still functions to this day as a democratic system of government. Now, of course, in 1788, the American Constitution is ratified. And on the bicentennial of that event, Concurrent Resolution 331 is passed, which recognizes that the American government is in part founded on concepts that may be found within Native societies. However, it's fairly heavily debated. And when we look through history, of course, we see arguments on one or both sides where that's the case. However, I would like to point out to you today, not necessarily clear evidence of one or the other, but some examples of what people are saying in the 18th century. Some examples of that cultural conversation around topics of government and society that you can interpret as to whether or not may be evidence of influence. So I think I'll start in the spring of 1776 in a letter from John Hancock to Colonel George Morgan, April 19th, 1776. He says that the Continental Congress is going to retrace the white roots of peace, referencing that white pine tree for the Five Nations, appointing the first Indian agent, George Morgan, to go out to the Six Nations and present them with a wampum belt that has been created by the Congress, right? So it is 2,500 beads. Wampum is what we refer to as these shell beads. They are the means by which we record our history, our laws and constitutions, and other important legal information. And so a belt with 13 white diamonds was created to be given to the Iroquois as a symbol of their want for unity. So 13 unified colonies. Much like you see with the Hiawatha Belt, where we have the white pine tree and then all of the other nations joined together as a symbol of unity. And so we think about, from the time of, say, John Locke to the foundation of the American Constitution, this cultural exchange is evident in many different sources. I'll be using a couple of different things like Mr. Benjamin Franklin and his writings, the Albany Plan, his own personal papers, his speech that he gives to the Constitutional Convention. And so to start with that, the prayer speech at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, in his first paragraph there, Mr. Franklin says, "We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom since we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to the ancient history for models of government and examined those republics which, having been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. And we have viewed many modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to their circumstance." And so when we think about this concept, many people sort of naturally assume that the idea of a republic wholly comes from folks like the Romans. But it's also been practiced here in North America for thousands of years. And so when we look about what other people are writing about Native nations and their systems of government and society and the way that they view them compared to their own, folks like Cadwallader Colton, who wrote The Brief History of Five Nations for the governor of New York at the time, William Burnett, in 1727, he says, "Each of the nations of themselves is an absolute republic, governed in all public affairs of war and peace, by the sachems or old men, whose authority and power is gained by and consists wholly in the opinions of the rest of the nation in their wisdom and integrity. They never execute their resolutions by compulsion or force upon any of their people. Honor and esteem are their principal rewards, as shame and being despised are their punishments. The Five Nations have such absolute notions of liberty that they allow no kind of superiority over one another and have banished all servitude from their territories." And again on that topic of the Romans, "When life and liberty came into competition, indeed, I think our Indians have outdone the Romans in this particular. The Five Nations consist of men whose courage and resolution cannot be shaken. We are fond of searching into remote antiquity to know the manners of our earliest progenitors, and if I be not mistaken, the Indians are the living images of them. All right? And so when we think about the conversation around American Indians, often in history what happens is sort of a cowboys and Indians view of this story, a very, very oversimplified black and white concept of sort of a government, of an empire, of Europeans here arriving on this continent and finding the Indians as loose, small, disorganized, violent communities that have no real structure or have no tangible history. And that could not be farther from the truth. And I think that's what a lot of this debate largely comes to, is people's cognitive dissonance of seeing Indians for the very first time as organized. And so if we think about coming into that system of organization, right, I think it's important to recognize that the United States is making treaties from its inception with the Delaware, and others to try and build up its reputation on the world stage. Think about Conestoga and his sort of advice to the new nation when asked what he could give. He says, "We heartily recommend union and a good agreement between you, our brethren. Never disagree, but preserve a strict friendship for one another, and thereby you, as well as we, will become the stronger. Our wise forefathers established union and amity between the 5 nations, and this has made us formidable. This has given us great weight and authority with our neighboring nations. We are a powerful confederacy, and by you observing the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power. Therefore, whatever befalls you, never fall out with one another." And the last historical source that I will give you here before we move on into a couple of modern documents and get into some questions would be Benjamin Franklin's Hints or Terms for a Durable Union, published in 1774, preceding his Albany Plan of Union. He says, "It would be a very strange thing that if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and be able to execute it in such a manner that it has subsisted ages, and appears indissoluble, and yet that a like union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies, to whom it is more necessary, and must be more advantageous, and who cannot be supposed but to want an equal understanding of their interests." So, just like John Locke said, the concept of freedom must be something inherently human, because people across the world, using the 6 nations as an example when he speaks about the inherent rights of man, must be something that these people understand as well. And so, like Mr. Franklin says, if they can do it, why can't we? Now, in 1988, I did say that Congress formally recognized the contributions of the Iroquois Confederacy, and to quote this document, Concurrent Resolution 331, published October 5th, 1988, it says, "A concurrent resolution to acknowledge the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy of Nations to the development of the United States Constitution, and to reaffirm the continuing government-to-government relationship between Indian tribes and the United States established in the Constitution. Whereas the original framers of the Constitution, most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. Whereas the Confederation of 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois League of Nations, as were many of the democratic principles incorporated into the Constitution itself." Now, what's interesting about this document is that it is published at the bicentennial of the ratification of the Constitution. It was heavily lobbied for by Gregory Schaff, who was a professor at Case Western Reserve University. He was also the ethnohistorian for the Oneida Nation at the time. And in a rebuttal to him, a faculty publication from the Case Western University, "The Imaginary Connection Between the Great Law of Peace and the United States Constitution," it was noted by the author, Eric M. Jensen, that there was no connection between the 2 documents, the Great Law of Peace and the American Constitution, going so far as to say, to think that these extraordinary men who met in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia took anything from the Indians but military support, he says, is nonsense. And so we think about, up into the modern day, this topic has been debated quite heavily, and I assume it will be debated for decades more. But when it comes to solid evidence, there is fairly little to say that these specific things that come out of the Great Law of Peace and our government system are directly linked to the American Constitution. Think about the Magna Carta. Think about the English Constitution. Influences from, say, the Dutch and other European nations around the English that the Americans may have been familiar with. This may have made up some of the fabric of the American Constitution. To what degree and to where, it's not clear. But with all of the things that I've given you here, and with kind of seeing a little bit of a counter-argument, I hope that you would be able to sort of make up your mind, or maybe do some research on your own, look into this a little bit more. Maybe visit with the Six Nations website and learn a little bit about what they have to say on the matter as well. But to talk a little bit more about the Great Law of Peace before I open it up for questions, this document is 117 articles, and this greatly differs from the American Constitution in many, many ways, the primary being cultural, right? So if you think about these 117 articles, almost a quarter of that document relates to the rights of women, the rights of minorities within society, immigrants, and to folks who are coming into our country from the outside. And so the American Constitution at its whole, and you think about some similarities being like 3 branches of government, a bicameral system, checks and balances, and some dissimilarities like term limits, right? So all of these kinds of things you can kind of point to as arguments for or against any influence whatsoever. But now, I would like to open it up for questions and see what y'all are curious about.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We already have some questions coming in here, some about what you're wearing, but I'm going to kick off with one. You hit real briefly there at the end, some of the similarities, some of the differences. Are there any other differences between these two documents that really show? Because if you get into them, they really are quite different from one another. But there are also some that you mentioned earlier. However, I hope you can hit the differences, and then there are also some similarities we were talking about just before we went live between the two that I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, so as far as the differences are concerned, I would say when it comes to comparing these two documents, the differences, for the most part, much outweigh the similarities. And that largely, again, has to do with the fact that the Iroquois Constitution is almost entirely a cultural document. And so you think about the structure of government is actually not the majority of this binding document. And so one of the instances that I will point to, as sort of a difference here, let me find it, because I definitely do not want to misquote this very important document. Let's see here, I do believe it is an early wampum. Anyway, I won't misquote it, but I won't also take too much time to find it. And it has to do with the qualifications of the statesmen themselves, right? So what does someone need to do in order to become qualified for being elected? And also, who controls that election process, right? As one of the main differences within this document, the women are at the core of everything. We are, of course, a matriarchal, matrilineal society, and so the women put forward candidates that they believe are the best choices to lead the people. Rather than having sort of open elections, there are candidates submitted by those women. And so the women are the heads of our households, of our clans, and therefore they are sort of naturally the core and head of our government structure. So the clan mothers will put forward candidates that people will vote for out of sort of a pool. There are also term limits for a lot of these positions as well. So those are some of the mechanical differences that I can point to, along with, again, the vast cultural differences that are there. But to those similarities that you mentioned, some other things that you can think about from the 18th century, even down to that speech that I told you about, one arrow is easily broken, but many bound together are strong. Think about the symbols of the United States, right? If you can picture in your head the seal of the United States, it's a bald eagle, a bundle of arrows, and an olive branch. The symbols of the League of Nations, a bald eagle, a bundle of arrows, and a white pine tree. The phrase, we the people, right? In some translations, you will see this phrase, we the people, of the 5 nations to form an unbreakable bond of brotherhood, right? Which is where the title of this program comes from. Which you may be able to draw a conclusion to say that had some influence on John Rutledge in the 5th Constitutional Convention, introducing the phrase, we the people, right? Government of the people. And so there are all these sort of loose correlations that we see in and amongst the 18th century documents, with really no hard line to say that one correlates to the other. So it's really up to you to decide if you think there is any connection at all.
Thank you for that, Talon. It is really tough. We can never get into the minds of the people of the past, unfortunately. But getting back to the questions from some of our viewers today, Karen wants to know, what do the beads either on your head and the symbols on your bands mean? And I know we were also talking, you and I, prior to starting, about that wampum that you have there and what some of those symbols mean.
So that's a really great question. So the beads are particular and important. As far as like the bands that I'm wearing and the silver jewelry, those things are largely decorative. And so this here is what's referred to as a diadem. You'll see it quilled examples. You'll see some earlier twined examples, and then some other beaded examples like this when glass beads become popular and common. But prior to glass beads here in North America, the primary method by which we're doing any type of loom woven beadwork is what's known as wampum. This is an unfinished belt that I'm working on, and it is the dish with one spoon. Now our wampum is used in Shawnee and Samoan we call this wapapiaka, and this means the pure or the clean beads, the white beads. And these belts are used to record our history, our laws and constitution, our military alliances, our treaties, and all of the things that we would deem public information. And I know that you can't see the rest of my arms or my legs, but our tattoos are what we use to record our personal information. As it was told to me, that information is as permanent as we are, but this will last generations. And so if you walk into, say, a council house, you may see displayed there for you all of the laws of this community and its active treaties. There are people who are responsible for keeping the belts that are associated with our constitutions and such like that. And so these are extremely important. These are noted by many communities to be a gift from the Creator as a means of passing on that information. Without a system of writing, this is the closest thing that you can kind of compare to, say, records our history. So it's noted by many, or it's thought by many Europeans historically that Native Americans had no history or had no concept. But Benjamin Franklin, in his essay, remarks concerning the savages of North America, he says, the business of the women is to prepare the food and dress the ground, nurse the children, preserve and hand down to posterity the memory of public transactions. These, I apologize there. The business of the women is to take exact notice of what passes and print it in their memories, and for they have no writing, communicate it to their children. They are the records of the councils, and they preserve the traditions and stipulations and treaties 100 years back, which when we compare with our writings, we always find exact. And so these belts have been preserved for hundreds and hundreds of years and largely remain unaltered in their retelling.
So another question that's kind of specific to you. Barbara wants to know, where did you learn to speak your native tongue?
So I actually, I'm from the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, a federally recognized tribe. And I grew up there, and I participated in our language classes, and helped out there as a summer employee, and went to language competitions at OU. We took first, second, third several times. Very proud of that. And so I was part of a language class and part of our language revitalization program there in Oklahoma.
Great. To get back into questions of government, Tammy was asking, how did the Proclamation of 1763 affect the Native peoples in Virginia? And I kind of have a curiosity. Was that worked through the Great Law of Peace? Was that a singular document that affected all Native peoples? Or where did it really feel like its restraints, its limits?
So, to kind of touch on two topics here, the Proclamation of 1763 and how it affected different Native governments separately from one another. Because I'm talking about this document as one of dozens of democratic republics that you see throughout the Eastern Woodlands, right? And so we consider one another just as foreign as we would consider England or Spain or France or Germany. And so the Proclamation of 1763, the way that I would say a lot of Native people are going to be looking at that document, or the way that I've always kind of heard it talked about, is Of course, no English subject is to settle west of the Allegheny Mountains for the protection of Indian allies in their lands. The king just got through fighting a very expensive war, and almost a third of the English economy is based on trade with the tribes in the western frontier in skins and furs. And so to protect and sustain that territory, the king is very much aware that those tribes are sort of the primary stewards of that territory, and they have sustained this trade for long enough, and are complaining about Europeans cutting down trees and driving game farther and farther west, which is going to, of course, raise the price for England. Now, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Cherokee, these large nations that are competing for control of this trade, are doing so on a government level with England, on that government-to-government business, right? Two sovereign countries dealing with one another. And so they are playing other nations against one another for their own benefit, like the Treaty of Hard Labor, for example, where Cherokees sell off parts of Shawnee land, which is almost a direct cause, or is a direct cause, to Lord Dunmore's War in 1774.
Here's another question. Asking that colonists were often at odds with the American Indians, so why would they look to their governments if they, just as you were mentioning there with the Proclamation line of 63, if they're at odds with one another, why would they also look to them for influence?
Well, and I think that is another, so looking to Native Americans for influence, or sort of having any admirable qualities whatsoever, is one of those things that, again, I think comes more so out of the Cowboys and Indians' perspective on history than it does actual historical information. For instance, I will use Cadwallader Calden's Brief History of the Five Nations, right? When one talks of the Five Nations in France, they are thought by a common mistake to be mere barbarians, always thirsting after human blood. But their true character is very different. They are as politic and judicious as well can be conceived. This appears from their management of affairs which they transact not only with the French and the English, but likewise with almost all Indian nations of this vast continent. And so in the 18th century, and with folks who are actually interacting with Native people, like Lieutenant Henry Timberlake, understand the complexities of Native culture, understand their government systems, and so the concept of always being at odds, this black and white, this sort of dichotomy, right, is not really something that we see so clear-cut in history. There are things that are being transferred back and forth between not only Europeans and Native folks, but Africans as well, who are also being made citizens within our nation, and who are bringing their cultural concepts with them as well.
I have a question here. I apologize to the commenter because I'm afraid I may mispronounce the name, but Mahalani wanted to know what are some of the articles that deal with immigration in that Iroquois Constitution?
Well, let's see. Articles that deal with immigration. Let's see. The war chiefs, clans, immigration, foreigners. It's in the back. You can actually find this document online as well. So if you're curious about what this document says, or what the system of government is, they have great resources for you to be able to learn about this as well. So in the title of foreigners, Wampum number 74, alien nations admitted on a temporary basis. When any alien nation of an individual is admitted into the League, the admission shall be understood to be only a temporary one. Should the person or nation create loss or do wrong, cause suffering of any kind, the war chiefs will reprimand them. If a similar offense is committed, the offending party shall be expelled from the League. Temporary adoptions, alien refugees seeking permanent residence, foreign nations urged to accept the Great Peace, about war and having men ready. So there are several wampums that deal with the title of immigration. But for the most part, the concept is that we will house and shelter these people, and we will treat them. Actually, I think again, Mr. Franklin wins the ticket here because he very much so puts it into perspective. Their manner of entering one another's villages likewise has its rules. It is reckoned uncivil in traveling strangers to enter a village abruptly without giving notice of their approach. Therefore, as soon as they arrive within hearing, they stop and hollow, remaining there till invited to enter. 2 old men usually come out to them and lead them in. There is in every village a vacant dwelling called the stranger's house. Here they are placed while the old men go round from house to house, acquainting the inhabitants that strangers have arrived who are probably hungry and weary, and every one of them sends what he can to spare of victuals and skins to repose on. when the strangers are refreshed, pipes and tobacco are brought, and then, but not before, conversation begins, with inquiries as to who they are, whether bound, what news, etc., and it usually ends in offers of service, and if the strangers have occasion of guides or any necessaries for continuing their journey, and nothing is exacted for this entertainment.
Okay, we are coming to the end of our time, but I think we have time for a question or two more. Kathy wants to know, how do you weigh the Great Law of Peace against the British government as influencers of our Constitution's framers?
So when it comes to weighing how much different sources are contributing to the American Constitution, this is again where we go back to that idea of hard evidence, right? So the Europeans of the time, the Anglo-Americans who are creating the U.S. Constitution, are coming from this monarchy, which they are very well acquainted with, right? And these sort of radical ideas, of the individual liberties and those sort of things. Think about the treatises of two governments, right? I'll use that as an example, where Robert Farmer says that people are not meant to govern themselves, that the self-governance is what caused the fall of man. And so the divine authority of the king is sort of rightful. And John Locke's response to that being that freedom is something imprinted on the human being. These are notions that we also hold as well that may be parallel in many, many cases to what the United States is going to create. Whether or not it had any hard influence was certainly seen as an example that it can work. However, the British government, the Magna Carta, the English Constitution are very, very hard line being drawn from, and ideas are being transferred into the American government because those are their traditions. These are English people. And so it is only natural for them to transfer one written word to the next.
So it really is one of those difficult things. When we're talking about American democracy, we can be talking about the English-inspired American Constitution, and we can even be talking about the Law of Peace as two separate but parallel tracks that happen in history. I think that's absolutely fascinating, because I think you were even saying before that there are those who reject that the Iroquois Constitution is influential because they feel it is so separate from the American.
And there are many Native people today as well who are not fond of the idea of the Iroquois or systems of government here being influential or having created the United States because, as I think I've said before, or as is stated even in this rebuttal, this government, which has done so little, if not, such wrongdoings to Native people, being created out of its own systems, is not without its irony. And so there are many Native people today who feel they don't want any association governmentally with, say, the United States because of what other people are kind of implementing on their behalf.
A difficult subject, and unfortunately we have just come to the end of our time, so this is my last question for you. How can people learn more? As you referenced earlier, that document can be found online. If people want to know more about American Indians, Native peoples, their governments, both in history as well as in the modern day, what would you recommend to them?
Well, if you want to learn about Native people, I would recommend wholeheartedly, first and foremost, that you go and talk to Native people, right? And I think that goes then back to that concept within American Indian history. Oftentimes, people think that we are long gone, that we exist only in the pages of history, and that the only way that they can learn anything about us is by going to the library. And if that's what you have at your disposal, of course, you're welcome to do that. But Native people still exist, we're still around, and we are eager to answer your questions. Go to tribal websites, and so look up the Bureau of Indian Affairs Registry of Federally Recognized Tribes. Go to their tribal websites, and they will have historical information oftentimes there for you to learn more about them. And so people like the Onondaga and the Oneida have an excellent resource about wampum, what it means, different treaties, and how they view them in their own history. And so I would encourage you, first and foremost, to always go and talk to Native people, because for the last 400 years, we have not been the main tellers in our own history. So,
Thank you.
But with that, I know that that is the final question, and I would like to thank you very much for joining us for this Facebook live stream. Again, I encourage you to check out the rest of the Facebook live streams, not only from the American Indian interpreters, but from our other colleagues as well. And I would like to thank donors who make these kinds of programs possible. And I will say, Salanoki Kinole.